So let's talk about static local variables. So basically we've already just talked about that local variables only exist while the function is executing. Once the function terminates, that variable is basically erased. But sometimes we want the program to remember the value of the variable in between function calls. So we can do that with a static local variable. So static local variables retain the contents between function calls. So I'm just going to put that. So these static local variables retain the contents in between function calls. And so I'm going to show you how to create one in a second. Let's just look at a few things about them first. So first of all, they're initialized to 0 by default. So if you create a static variable and you don't initialize it to anything, it's going to be initialized to 0 by default, like global variables. Static local variables are also only initialized once. So since the function retains their value, because normally if you're running a function, if you're calling a function multiple times, it's going to reinitialize the variables every time you call the function. But with a static local variable, since they retain the value that's saved into the function between function calls, they're only initialized once. So they're initialized when the variable is created, and then they're not created again while the program's running because they don't need to be. So let's look at how we would create one. So let's say that we have, this function. So void show static, and then let's just do. So the way that we define a static local variable is we just put static in front of our variable. So it would be static int, let's say we have an integer, and then the name of our variable. And we'll initialize it to 5, because remember, if you don't initialize it to anything, it's going to be 0. So if you don't want it to be, a lot of times you might want it to be 0 because you might be counting the number of times the function runs. But if you want it to be something other than 0, you need to initialize it to that. And let's just do a cout statement. So cout stat num end line, and then so then we want to increment this variable because we might be counting how many times this function's running, but we're starting at 5. So let's do stat num ++, and then let's write some code in our main function that's going to call this function. So let's do our int main, and let's say that we have a for loop. So this is like the while loop. So for int count is equal to 0, count less than, let's just do less than 5, and then count ++, and then we're going to call this function, so show static, and then return 0. So let's look at what this code is going to do. So we're going to start out, so our count is 0, so I'm just going to put count is equal to 0. It goes into this for loop, count is less than 5, so it's going to run the contents of the loop. So it's going to get to the show static, and it's going to call that show static function. And so then we get down to that function, and stat num is equal to 5. So this has cout stat num, so this is literally going to print out 5. And then it's going to increment stat num to 6. So now stat num is equal to 6. So let's put that. And then this is going to go back up to this for loop, and count was incremented, so count is equal to 1 now. And count 1 is still less than 5, so it's going to call this show static function again. It's going to go down to the show static function, and it's not going to recreate that stat num variable because it's a static variable. So statnum is actually equal to 6 now, so when this gets to the cout statement, it's going to print out 6. And then it's going to increment statnum, so now statnum is equal to 7. And then it's going to go back up to this for loop, and so count is equal to 2 now. That's still less than 5. So it's going to call the show static function again, go down to the function. Statnum is currently equal to 7, so it's going to cout 7. And it's going to keep doing that through a couple more times. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Once count is equal to 5. So basically we're just retaining the value that's stored in that variable in between function calls.